So psychologists are often in the business of refining common sense. Everybody in their daily lives is a psychologist. We have lots of thoughts about each other. We have lots of beliefs about why people do what they do. Everybody's an intuitive psychologist in their daily lives. What we're often in the business of is refining that common sense based on what we learn about reality. And so Aristotle, centuries ago, said that man is by nature a social animal. That part is sort of common sense. Our social relationships are critical for us. But I don't think Aristotle had any idea of just how deeply true that was. You see the importance of our sociality almost everywhere you look for our well-being and our health. So you see it when you just look between our ears. Our brains, our neocortex in particular, is about 3 times bigger than our nearest primate relative, the chimpanzee. Most of those neurons seem to be involved in social cognition and thinking about others. Living in large social groups requires a lot of neural capacity to keep track of who knows what, who to trust and who to avoid. Our brains reflect the importance of those social connections. You also see the importance of sociality in our health. Loneliness turns out to be deadly for you, as big a risk factor for mortality as smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. It's a rather stunning result. Sociality is also critical for happiness. Everybody knows in some way how important quality social relationships are with others. Loneliness is a major determinant of unhappiness, much bigger, we find in some experiments, in fact, in some surveys, than money or lacking money is for happiness. Social relationships are critical for happiness and for well-being and health. And so the question that we're interested in is, if sociality is so good for us in lots of ways, so important for our well-being and for our health, are people doing it enough? Are people social enough in their everyday lives for their own well-being? If you look around in the world, in day-to-day life, you see lots of opportunities for social engagement that people aren't taking. Consider an experiment that we conducted a few years ago on the trains coming into Chicago from the south side, on buses in downtown Chicago, and also from cabs leaving Midway Airport. Every day I ride the train into Chicago, and every day I see exactly the same drama play out. People get on the train, they sit down cheek to jowl next to somebody else, and they spend 45 minutes then ignoring this person, the most social species, or certainly most social primate on the planet, who's made happier and healthier by engaging in conversation with somebody else, nevertheless ignoring this person, treating them like a lampshade. Why do people do that? Well, in some experiments that we conducted, we find that when we actually ask people to engage in a conversation with this person, try to connect with this person and get to know the person who sits down next to you today, we find that doing that actually made people happier, enjoy their commute more than when we randomly assign them to a condition where we ask them to keep to themselves, to remain in solitude and just focus on their day ahead. Nevertheless, when we asked a separate group of people to predict how they would feel, they actually predicted they would be less happy if they engaged in conversation with this person than if they kept to themselves. That is, people were behaving in a way that they thought was rational, consistent with common sense. They thought they would enjoy their commute more if they kept to themselves than if they engaged in conversation, but that bit of common sense just proved to be mistaken. And the reason that people seem to have this expectation, we learned in subsequent research, wasn't because they misunderstood really how much they might enjoy the conversation, but rather because they thought the person sitting next to them didn't want to connect with them, didn't want to engage in conversation, and that led them to think that the conversation would be a little awkward and that they would be happier if they just didn't engage in it. We find that kind of barrier operating, keeping people from engaging in positive social connections in other domains as well. So consider something you could do right now that would make you happier, or at least you could do in a few minutes after you're done watching this. You could write a gratitude letter to somebody else. That's another positive pro-social action that we know reliably makes people happier, and you probably haven't done it today. In experiments, both in my classes that I teach here, as well as in experiments in the laboratory, we ask people to write gratitude letters to somebody who's done something meaningful for them, but who they feel like they haven't fully expressed their gratitude to yet. We ask them to predict how the recipient is going to feel. We then email the recipient and find out how they actually felt when they received this letter. And we then just compare the two numbers against each other. And what we find is that our gratitude letter writers systematically underestimate how positive an experience this is going to be for the recipient. They tend to predict that the recipients will be happy, but they're even happier than that. They also tend to underestimate how surprised the recipient will be to get the letter, and letter writers also overestimate how awkward the recipient will be to receive the letter. And we find that those predictions about awkwardness in particular serve as a barrier for people to writing the letter. If I don't think the letter is going to make you feel very happy, it's going to be a little weird, then I might not write it. We find that those expectations that are guiding people's behavior are just a little miscalibrated. We find similar results in other places too. Another thing you do to make yourself happier today would be to do some random act of kindness for somebody else, another kind of pro-social action. We find that people underestimate how positive recipients will be to be on the receiving end of some random act of kindness. We ran a study in downtown Chicago in the dead of winter where we had people at the Maggie Daley skating rink giving away free cups of hot chocolate to a stranger in the park that they identified. We had those who were giving away the cups of hot chocolate predict how the recipient would feel, and then we measured how the recipient actually felt. Again, those who were giving away, who were performing the random act of kindness, underestimate how positive an experience it was going to be for the recipient. We find that these mistaken expectations about the consequences of social interaction also affect how people engage in conversation once they're actually engaged with somebody, once they're actually being social. It's not just a barrier to engaging in an action, it's also a barrier to how you enact the social interaction once you're already talking. In particular, we find that people might not be deep enough. They might be too superficial for their own well-being in conversation. That is, they don't ask meaningful enough questions about somebody else once they're already talking to somebody else. So we find these mistaken expectations about others' reactions in social settings might also lead people to not be social enough once they're engaging in an interaction with somebody else. That is, we find that these mistaken expectations can sometimes lead people to be too superficial for their own well-being in conversation. That is, to not ask deep or meaningful enough questions or engage in deep or meaningful enough conversation with somebody else to maximize the well-being that they and the other person get from this interaction. So we find, for instance, that if you give people a list of questions that are really deep and meaningful, they tend to underestimate how positive they're going to feel if they engage in that deep conversation. And they also tend to overestimate how awkward that conversation is going to be compared to engaging in a conversation about relatively shallow questions. So these deep questions that we have people discuss include things like, what are you most grateful for in your life? Tell me about it. Or, can you tell me about the last time you cried in front of another person? We find in these situations that people think those conversations are going to be much more negative than they actually are. In fact, they form a very strong bond with somebody else, stronger than they expect, and they enjoy the conversation much more than they expect, and they dramatically overestimate how awkward that conversation is going to be. And of course, that awkwardness serves as a barrier to asking deeper and more meaningful questions of somebody else in conversation and pushes people towards more superficial conversation than might be good for their own well-being. So our data don't suggest that you should engage in social interaction or engage in these pro-social activities constantly or nonstop. Of course they don't. In the same way that a physician who tells you to exercise doesn't want you to be at the gym 16 hours a day, right? Our data suggests instead that when you feel the urge to engage in some social interaction, when there's somebody you might like to have a conversation with, or there's somebody you've been meaning to thank who you haven't, or there's some important thing you'd like to share with somebody but you're a little reluctant because you're worried about how they respond, those are the cases where you should go ahead and engage in the conversation, or write the letter, or share the compliment, or share something meaningful about yourself, because those are the cases where the expectation is probably a little off, is probably miscalibrated.